So in our last example, we had this conditional statement. If you have visited the Louvre, you have been to Paris. And we wrote the converse. If you have been to Paris, then you visited the Louvre. Okay, well, clearly this statement is true because if you have visited the Le Louvre, okay, that's in Paris. You've been to Paris. But if you've been to Paris, you might not necessarily have been to this particular attraction. Okay, so that is the converse. And the example that we're on right now is the inverse. The inverse and the converse get confused very often. The inverse, if your library book is damaged, then you have to pay a fine. If your library book is not damaged, then you will not have to pay a fine. Okay, we already determined that this statement is true. If your book is damaged, you have to pay a fine. Is the inverse true? If your library book is not damaged, then you don't have to pay a fine. We already know that's false because of the example that I just gave us earlier. Because just because your library book isn't damaged doesn't mean you won't have to pay a fine because it could be late. So now, we're going to see if we can write the inverse. If you visited the Louvre, you have been to Paris. The inverse is if you have not visited the Louvre, then you have not been to Paris. Okay, so if you have not visited the Louvre, then you have not been to Paris. And we know that's a false statement because just because you haven't visited the Louvre, I mean, you could have been to Paris, you might have just not visited that attraction. So those are the two conditionals that get confused the most. The last one is the contrapositive, where it's the inverse and the converse together. There's a switch of the hypothesis and the conclusion, and there's also a negation. We make them both negative, okay? So if your library book is damaged, then you have to pay a fine. If you do not have to pay a fine, then your library book is not damaged. Okay, let's think about what that is. What's the truth statement? Is that true? We already decided that if your library book is damaged, you have to pay a fine. That's true. Is the contrapositive true? If you do not have to pay a fine, then your library book is not damaged. And you're not paying any money, then we know for sure that your book isn't damaged, because if it was damaged, you'd be paying a fine. So what I'm getting at here is the truth value of the original conditional statement and the contrapositive are the same. So if the original statement is true, then the contrapositive is true. And if the inverse is true, then the converse is true. So they have the same truth values. Oh gosh, where? Oh, here we go. And I think let's write one example of a contrapositive. All right. What is the contrapositive of if our plane is not late, then we make our connecting flight? So remember, we have to switch the hypothesis and the conclusion and make them both, we have to negate both of them. See if you can do it. If we do not make our connecting flight, then our plane is late. You see how the not comes out? We're not going to write is not. Right? Just like when we're learning about negative times the negatives of positive. Not. We're just going to write it's late.